Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining SQFI, FMI, and some milk growers for a discussion on the new FSMA Produce Safety Rule. My name is Leslie Jones. I'm an administrator here at SQFI, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Today's discussion on the FSMA Produce Safety Rule is presented by Dr. Hilary Thesmar, Vice President of Food Safety Programs at the Food Marketing Institute. In her role as the Vice President of Food Safety Programs for FMI, Dr. Thesmar provides leadership for all food safety programs for the Food Marketing Institute's retail and wholesale members, and provides support for members on food safety training programs, recall plans and management, crisis management, research, and overall safety and sanitation programs. She also works with the FMI Foundation on food safety education and research projects. Dr. Thesmar has a PhD in food technology from Clemson University, a Master of Science degree in human nutrition from Winthrop University, a bachelor's degree in food science from Clemson, and she's also a registered dietitian. She has over 1 decade of experience in scientific and regulatory affairs with food trade associations and is an active member of the Institute of Food Technologists, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and also the International Association for Food Protection. And with that, I'd like to now turn the mic over to Dr. Hilary Thesmar, who will begin today's discussion on the Produce Safety Rule. Hilary?
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about the FSMA rules. The rules have been out for a little over 2 months now, and there's still a lot of discussion, so hopefully we can clarify what's in the produce rule and answer some questions that you might have. So I do want this to be interesting. The rules can be pretty dry, and I want it to be applicable to your facilities and your operations. So if I'm not hitting the mark, please let me know and we can redirect. But I will move fairly quickly, but I do want to cover pretty much everything that's in the produce rule. So let's start with what I'm going to talk about today, and that is just an overview of all of the FSMA rules so you can understand where produce fits in. The definition of a farm, and I'm sure you're aware that this definition is very important and received quite a bit of attention during the rulemaking process. I'll go over some key points and definitions that are in the produce rule, and then who the produce rule applies to. So, what type of farm, what type of operation does it apply to, and does it apply to me? The exemptions, and then the main requirements of the rule, so really the meat of the safety standards. On the next slide, this is an overview of what's in the Food Safety Modernization Act. So let's go back about 5 years, and actually a little more than 5 years now, because the rule just turned 5 years old. It was signed in January of 2011. It was going through Congress prior to that. And it started as a very simple concept, and these are the 4 kind of buckets or 4 main components that are in FSMA. And if you remember at the time what was going on in the 5 years prior to FSMA being passed, we had several major food safety crises in this country. So we had spinach outbreak, we had the tomato and pepper recall and outbreaks, and then we had tomatoes were implicated at first, and then it turned out to be peppers, and a couple other things were implicated too. And then we'd also had melamine from China. That was more of an economic adulteration, but it caused illnesses and deaths in infants, also in pets, and was an imported product. We had also had the peanut recall with Peanut Corporation of America with the peanut paste and peanut butter products. So we'd had quite a few crises leading up to this, and those crises really shaped this rule. So the components of the rule are prevention. We want to prevent foodborne illnesses and prevent contamination. We want to give the FDA more authority for increased inspections. we want to protect our imports. We had quite a bit of problems with imports leading up to this, so there's a huge focus on import safety. Then there's also a focus on enhanced partnerships. We can't get this done if everybody works in a silo, so FDA and Congress really focused on increased communication and partnerships. So that's really how the rule started, and you can see those elements in the rule. But the devil's in the details. So as it went through, it got more and more complex. So now there are many, many components to FSMA, many regulations, a lot of rules that we have from FDA, a lot of requirements from the actual statute, but the big thing that you hear a lot about are the 7 major rules. And these were the rules under the court order, and they started rolling out in their final forms in September. Actually, the court order was late August, but they were published in the Federal Register in September. But these 7 pillars of prevention, so these are the 7 big rules of FSMA that really shape FSMA. They are preventive controls for human food, preventive controls for animal food, produce safety, foreign supplier verification, third-party auditor accreditation, intentional adulteration or prevention of intentional adulteration, and then sanitary transport. And the timing of these rules is the following. So the final deadline for the preventive controls rules, like I mentioned, it was late August. They were officially done by late August and sent to the Federal Register. We saw them on September 17th in the Federal Register. Produce safety was, the deadline was October 31st, and actually it published in the Federal Register a little bit after that. It was in November. Same with foreign supplier verification and third-party accreditation. We saw those in mid-November. The ones that are yet to come are the sanitary transport and then the intentional adulteration, which we refer to as food defense. And that's the common name for it. And those we'll see probably in the second quarter of this year. So the March 31st, we'll probably see that in April, and the food defense one we will see in June. So those really are our Q2 rules for this year, and we don't know what the final form looks like. We've seen the proposed rule for both. We haven't seen the final rule. So 5 of the 7 have been finalized, but we're still waiting for 2. So the big question for produce growers is, am I a farm? And that's a very complex question for most produce growers, and it depends on a lot of different things. So in the produce rule, the covered produce, the big general category about covered produce is raw agricultural commodities. So but it includes most raw agricultural commodities. Any fruit or vegetable, including mushrooms, sprouts, peanuts, tree nuts, and herbs, but it does not include grains. Grains are not covered under produce, under the produce rule, and it does not cover a category that FDA calls produce rarely consumed raw. There's an exhaustive list of this in the rule. Some examples for you include potatoes, peanuts, sweet corn, asparagus, beans, sugar beets, cocoa, coffee, and there are others. I just wanted to give you some examples of those. So the main parts of the rule, and it does get a little complex here. Most of the rules apply to FDA-registered facilities. So preventive controls applies to FDA-registered facilities, and many of the other rules, that's where they have their authority is in that registration component if facilities are required to register. The produce rule is different. So it does not apply to FDA-registered facilities because farms are not required to register with the FDA. There are no required food safety plans or CGMPs, current good manufacturing practices required, but depending on certain factors, farms may be subject to the produce safety rule. The preventive controls for human food rule actually revised the farm definition, and it reflected modern farming practices and had two further definitions. There's a primary production farm and a secondary production farm. So these rules are very interrelated and create kind of a web among them. So the definition for farms is actually dependent on the preventive controls rule, but it all kind of goes back to that registration, and do you have to register, do you not have to register? So that's where it gets really confusing. Farms do not have to register, but depending on what they have, what is being grown, harvested, packed at the farm determines the coverage under the produce rule. So a primary production farm, the definition is an operation under one management in general, but not necessarily contiguous location. So it could be multiple locations, but one management has manages the farm. So it's not ownership, it's management, and it's not location-based. So those are our key components, and that was very deliberate by FDA. The other component to this is it's devoted to the growing of crops, the harvesting of crops, the raising of animals, or any combination of those. So the definition was expanded. There were several iterations of the proposed rule. So we went through rulemaking, and it was proposed rule, and then there was a stage that was somewhat unusual, which is supplemental proposed rule, and then the final rule. So we got to see this rule a couple times before it was finalized. The definition was expanded to include operations that just grow crops and operations that just harvest crops. So that's primary farm. The primary farm can pack or hold raw agricultural commodities, regardless of who grew or raised them, and the manufacturing, processing, or packing or holding of foods, so long as all such food is consumed on the farm or another farm under the same management, or the manufacturing or processing falls into limited categories. So it gets complex, I know, but that's as specific as we could get, and that's actually language that's pretty clearly taken from the rule. The next definition is on the secondary activities of the farm, or secondary activities farms. This is an operation that is not located on a primary farm, and it's devoted to harvesting, packing, or holding the raw agricultural commodities, or RACs. The primary production farm that grows, harvests, or raise the majority of the RACs must own or jointly own a majority interest in the secondary activities farm. So it's one farm sending the RACs to a secondary farm for harvesting, packing, or holding. This definition also allows certain limited additional manufacturing, processing, packing, and holding. So it doesn't kick it into the preventive controls rule yet. It's still under the produce safety rule, but there's additional, and I'm going to be careful with my words, there's additional processing, packing, or holding that's happening to the raw agricultural commodity that's short of needing the preventive controls, that's short of requiring registration under the FDA preventive controls for human foods rule. So what is not defined as a farm? Manufacturing that goes beyond which falls in the farm definition. So pitting dried plums, chopping herbs, making snack chips or flours from legumes, roasting peanuts, tree nuts, or seeds. So those are some examples. There's obviously a lot of other examples, but those are the ones that FDA specifically gave in the rule. And FDA is issuing guidance on activities that fall within the farm definition and activities that do not fall within the farm definition in the near future. From my experience working on regulatory issues, the guidance doesn't always come in a comfortable timeline for the industry to work with in order to implement the regulations. So it's not always comfortable to wait for the guidelines to be published in order to start implementing the rules. So judgment can be used in order to determine what is under the farm definition and what is not under the farm definition if you're in that type of position. But they are coming out with guidance, and if you're in a situation where you're trying to figure out is this or isn't this, you can consult with experts or use a reasonable amount of judgment to determine that.
Hello, excuse me?
Yes.
I have a question regarding the secondary activities farm.
Yes.
So for the majority of us that are in this room, we're either a vertically integrated packer, grower, that packs more than 50% of our own fruit, or we are a cooperative where more than 50% of our member growers' fruit is packed at our facility. One of the questions that has come up more than once is for those vertically integrated packers where more than 50% of the tonnage they pack is their own, and for cooperatives where more than 50% of their tonnage is owned by our member growers, which definition do we fall under? Do we fall under the Produce Safety Rule, or do we fall under preventive controls? And I was wondering if I could get you to weigh in on that.
So that's an interesting situation. The definition requires, you know what, let me actually go to the rule and read the definition. It's probably very close to what I have in the slide. And I'm going to punt on this question, and I will help you with the technical language. FDA actually has a technical assistance network, and you can submit questions online to this technical assistance network, and they answer the question for you. So what we can do is ask the question of FDA, and they will give us an answer, and we can get back to you. The beauty in FMI submitting this for you is they will have no idea who is asking the question. So we can do it anonymously for you, but based on your corporate structure. So, you know, if you want to give us a little bit more detail about the vertical integration and the right language to use, I'd be happy to submit that question to FDA and get an answer back for you. And they'll never know who in the country it's coming from. So and my contact information is at the end of the presentation. I'm looking up the secondary activities farm. It's actually quite a long definition, but it is, I think it might be in the ownership piece of it. Jointly owns, the secondary activity farm owns or jointly owns a majority interest in the secondary activities farm. A secondary activities farm may also conduct these additional activities allowed on a primary activities farm. So it's not clear looking at this definition just really quickly. So let's go to the Technical Assistance Network and get that answer for you, and then it'll be FDA answering it rather than me, because my word isn't going to help you at all.
Hilary, this is Bob. I'll ask the gentleman he can write up the question right here and give it to me, and I'll bring it back to you.
Okay, that would be great. Okay. All right, so the slide that we're on is, does the produce rule apply to me? With this slide, and actually these should be flipped out. It's confusing the way it is, so let me flip it a little bit. Working through this, we want to start with the first box. Does your farm grow, harvest, pack, or grow produce? So if the answer is yes, you're in the rule, and you go down to the next question. The next question is, do you have an average of $25,000 or less in annual sales in the last 3 years? So if you're a small company and have less than $25,000 in annual sales average for the last 3 years? If the answer is yes, you're actually kicked out of the rule. So you're not required to be compliant with the rule. You have a small business exemption, you're out of it. It's called the Tester Amendment. If the answer is no, you actually continue down. So is your produce rarely consumed raw? Yeah, I need to get you an updated slide on this. So is your produce rarely consumed raw? If the answer is yes, and you're on the list, you're kicked out of it. If your answer is no, you're still in the rule. The next one is produce for personal on-farm consumption? So are you consuming it, for your family? Are you growing it for your family or, to feed relatives? Then if the answer is yes, you're kicked out of the rule. If the answer is no, you continue down. Is the produce intended for further processing with a kill step? So this would be if you're growing for a produce company that like a larger processor like a Dole or Del Monte or a canning facility or, a baking company with a kill step. So if the answer is yes, then you don't have to comply with produce safety. There is documentation required. If the answer is no, you're still in the rule. Are your annual sales less than $500,000 and the majority sold to qualified end users? If the answer is yes, you're kicked out of the rules. If the answer is no, you're still in it. Qualified end users is defined in the rule, and qualified end users are food service establishments or restaurants and retailers. So if you're a smaller business and selling directly to the end consumer, you're exempt from the rule. So I can tell you from FMI's point of view, as being the trade association that represents retail, we objected to this in the rulemaking process, in the comment process, because this puts the burden of having food safety standards on us. So if companies are exempt from food safety standards just because they're small and selling to us, that makes us have to police the industry and us have to have our suppliers have food safety standards in place. So all of you are at an SQF meeting, so obviously you have very high food safety standards in place, but there are a lot of companies out there that don't have any food safety standards in place, and really we don't want them selling to grocery stores without any food safety standards in place. So that was the basis of our objection to this. Obviously we didn't get it through the rule. So if all of those things are met, then the rule applies, but those are the exemptions in place basically. It's a little confusing. We will clarify that slide and make sure it's more clear in a version that can be shared. So for the implementation of the produce rule, the justification that FDA provided for this is they expect to prevent 1.57 million illnesses and save $400 million. I think it's more than that. I think it's $400,000 million. The science and risk-based rule is based on practices in the industry. They did want to focus on microbial contamination. This is not a rule that evaluates chemical contaminants or physical contaminants. So if you're used to HACCP, produce safety does not evaluate those hazards. It just evaluates microbial contamination. It does exclude the produce rarely consumed raw. It excludes produce to be further commercially processed. I mentioned documentation is required. There is flexible compliance based on business size, and I have a much more detailed slide at the end that talks about the compliance dates. But in general, very small farms have 4 years, small businesses have 3. For most people, it's 2 years. So for kind of general size farms, 2 years is the compliance date. So just to reiterate the exemptions again, produce that is not a raw agricultural commodity, produce that's rarely consumed raw per the item list, commercial processing, food grains, personal or on-farm consumption, and then a 3-year average value of produce sales of less than $25,000. So your roadside stand, your small local grower with minimal sales. So I mentioned the qualified exemption. Here's the official definition for that. So to qualify for the qualified exemption, the farms must have food sales averaging less than $500,000 over 3 years, and the sales to the qualified end users must exceed sales to all others. So they can't just they can't sell some to restaurants and retail and then sell a lot of products to other customers and then count the qualified exemption. It has to be, there's a ratio in there. And then the qualified end user is the consumer or a restaurant or retailer in the same state or Indian reservation or not located more than 275 miles away from the farm. So in essence, they're defining local for us in that definition. And then the modified requirements need special documentation and must be maintained and disclosed. So even though they're exempt, there's still record keeping and documentation and some reporting that goes along with this exemption. So now let's get to the main requirements of the rule. What do you have to do for produce safety? So all of that was kind of the administrative stuff, which is a lot and it's very confusing, but here's what farms actually have to do to protect food, the safety of the products. And there's 7 components to this: agricultural water, biological soil amendments, domesticated and wild animals, growing, harvesting, packing, and holding produce, worker training, health and hygiene, equipment, tools, and buildings, and then sprouts. So walking through these in more detail. The agricultural water, this one was pretty controversial in the rulemaking process and the subject of a lot of back and forth between growers and FDA and Congress and FDA, and it changed pretty significantly, the requirements during the rulemaking process. So water, the requirement is that water be safe and sanitary. How you get there is where the disagreements were. I don't think anyone disagreed that water has to be safe and sanitary. The beginning of the growing season, the requirement is to inspect the water source for hazards and prevent the water from being a source of contamination. There's language in there that I think is very interesting, to the extent they are under your control. So to the extent that the waters are under your control, that's what you have to prevent. The standard is no detectable generic E. coli in 100 milliliters of agricultural water, and there are requirements if water is not safe. So there's a whole level of requirements in the rule if water is not safe. So more on agricultural water, the testing requirements. So if water is from public sources or treated according to water treatments that are specified in the rule, there's no testing required. There's a survey required for untreated surface water and untreated groundwater. And then there's a microbial water quality profile that's required. And then there's very specific testing requirements in section 112.46 in the actual produce safety rule. And then more on agricultural water. For growing activities, the geometric mean standard is 126 CFU per 100 mils or less of generic E. coli, and a statistical threshold value of 410 CFUs per 100 mils or less of generic E. coli. For direct contact food contact surfaces or hand washing water, the standard is no detectable E. coli. So if water does not meet that criteria, then there's a whole level of requirements that have to be put in place, including holding the produce and not harvesting the produce and all kinds of things. And those requirements are in Section 112.45. So this webinar is not enough to tell you exactly what to do with everything. This is not comprehensive to tell you everything you have to do with agricultural water. This is just enough to tell you agricultural water is important, and you need to know to go look at the actual regulation and the standards, and whoever's in charge of your water supply needs to know more detail about it. So I just want to flag that for you. The next topic is the biological soil amendments. FDA in this section is really worried about the animal-based soil amendments. So they're worried about the untreated compost. They're worried about the agricultural tea. That was new to me. I learned a lot about that, and I don't know if that's used in your growing areas or not, but apparently they're quite concerned about it in some parts of the country. So the requirement is to evaluate the status of untreated soil amendments and to outline treatment processes that are acceptable, and they do have specific options for physical, chemical, and biological treatment options. So there are options for treatments to the compost and, you know, all kinds of any use of animal material in the soil amendments. There are specific organisms of concern, and they are Listeria monocytogenes, all Salmonella species, and E. coli 0157H7. The next major topic of prevention is domesticated and wild animals. I know you're probably aware that there's some major outbreaks that have been hypothesized to have been caused by animal infiltration into growing fields, and that is where this section came from. So the thought is to prevent animals from getting into the fields. If there's evidence of animals being in growing fields, then there needs to be kind of a stepwise analysis of that and evaluation of whether or not the produce can be harvested without being contaminated. So the standard is to evaluate a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard. So it's really dependent on observation, history, you know, evidence of contamination in the growing areas. The next one's growing, harvesting, packing, or holding. This section was quite simple, and that really surprised me because it seems like this is much more complex when it comes to produce safety. So I think there's some key words here that there's probably a lot more to, you know, behind the words. The key things that were in the rule were segregation of produce that is covered by regulations and not covered by the regulations. So there's a requirement that for the produce standards, if you are growing different types of crops, and some are covered by the produce regulations and some are not covered, you either have to treat everything under the standards, or you have to segregate your crops and make sure that you apply the produce standards to all of the covered produce, so that you make sure that it's covered, and then keep it segregated from the non-covered produce going forward through the harvesting and packing processes. The harvesting requirements are basically to avoid contamination, which is pretty simple, but it might be hard to do in practice. There is a requirement to avoid dropped produce unless the harvesting process itself requires the produce to be dropped. So and this does exclude root crops. So drop produce is not allowed. It does not include root crops or produce intentionally dropped to harvest. And then this also covers food packaging materials. So food packaging materials need to be evaluated for their safety and avoidance of contamination and other safety components. So that's pretty significant. Worker training, health, and hygiene. This is a pretty, this was also controversial as we were going through the rulemaking process. So this applies to all workers who handle produce, including harvesting and food contact surfaces, must have adequate training. Now, this doesn't mean you have to send everybody away to a 3-day training course. This means that you have to train them on what their job requires. So you have to do on-the-job training and document that training. So it can be very simple. It can be incorporated into your company's training program, but they have to know why the training is why it's important for them to wash their hands, why it's important for them not to come to work sick, why it's important for them to keep the surfaces clean, why it's important for them to keep the equipment clean. Whatever their job is, that's the sort of training that they need, and that does have to be documented. The other component is that there is now a reporting of ill workers to the manager, so that is significant. And then there's also hygiene requirements regarding hand washing. There's also visitor policies that have to be in place. So it's not prescriptive, but there has to be a visitor policy in place. So if you guys have SQF, you already have all of this. So it's going to be a pretty easy system for you to have, but you can imagine for the entire produce industry, this is going to be a pretty heavy lift. So equipment, tools, and buildings. You know there have been outbreaks in the produce industry that have been due to contamination of equipment that has been uncleanable. So this is a pretty a major portion of the rule. All contact equipment and equipment used to measure, regulate, or record conditions to control or prevent the growth of organisms of public health significance is included in this section. It has to be adequately designed, the construction has to be sound, and the workmanship has to be such that it can be cleaned and maintained. So they don't specify, you know, stainless steel and all of that. They just, the standard is that it's cleanable and it can be maintained to not contaminate. This also applies to transport vehicles. And then there's also a requirement that there be toilet and hand washing facilities available for workers. And that was extremely controversial in the rule. So those are now in place in the Produce Safety Rule. And then there's a whole section on sprouts. And this sprouts is the only commodity that's really singled out. And so there's a whole section on that. We can skip over this, but if you have any friends in the sprout business, they're going to have all kinds of additional requirements. This is the only commodity also that has required testing. All other testing in all of FSMA is basically based on the hazard analysis. This one does have required testing of the water or the sprout. So it's quite interesting how they handled sprouts very differently than they handled everything else. Records have to be kept. They're specified in the regulation of what that entails, but basically all of the 7 provisions that I just covered, those have to be documented. So there aren't specific records that have to be kept, but you have to document that those things are being done. So the records should include the farm name, the location, the covered produce, the growing areas, the date and time, and they have to be signed. So for example, when you check your water at the beginning of the growing season, that would be a record that would have to have all of those elements on it. Records have to be accessible to the FDA in 24 hours and be maintained for 2 years. Existing records are acceptable and may be supplemented if necessary to comply. So you don't have to keep a whole new set of FSMA records for the FDA. If you already have record keeping in process on, sanitation records or worker training records, you can use those to comply with FSMA. And they do allow off-site storage for records if the records are accessible in 24 hours. They also consider online storage completely compliant if the records can be assessed, either within 24 hours or on-site. They're actually considered on-site if it's like a cloud-based storage system. So that's completely possible. So I mentioned I had a more detailed slide on the compliance dates. This is actually from the FDA data, or from this FDA deck. So this tells you everything you want to know about the compliance dates. So what you want to do is you want to match up your size of business in the 3 bottom columns. So whether you're a very small business, or all other businesses, you're probably in the all other businesses, so the very bottom column, and then you can look and see what you have to do. So the first column is sprouts. The middle is covered activities involving all other covered produce, and then the right is farms eligible for a qualified exemption. So most of you are probably in that middle section in the bottom. So you're probably with your compliance dates for the agricultural water requirements are most likely 4 years, and your compliance dates for everything else is most likely 2 years. So just to simplify it. So if you're over $500,000 and you're not under a qualified exemption and you're not doing sprouts, it's going to be 4 years for water, 2 years for everything else, to simplify it a little bit. And that is produce safety in 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes or so.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for spending the time with us. We will get that gentleman's question, I hope, back to you, and we'll be able to submit it and see what they have to say.
Okay, great. And then we'll send the answer back. Thanks, Bob.
All right. Thank you very much.